and welcome back. You're now looking at part 2 of our Tom Petty caricature called Don't Come Around Here No More. On this video, we're going to be exploring the coloring method, but I thought we'd start with just a real brief kind of sped up 30-second review of what we accomplished in part 1, which is getting to our final line drawing. I've mentioned this in a couple of other videos, specifically maybe my Shaun of the Dead video. But the line work is very important to my method, so I might almost think of it as an end of step 1, if you will, when it comes to rendering the pieces that I come up with. Now, the line work is just kind of a throwback to when I was really kind of teaching myself to draw as a teenager and as a child. I did a lot of anatomy study through drawing pictures that I saw in comic books and similar type drawings. So this concept of like a big bold line work is really kind of important to my method. Now that we have that established, we're going to start getting into colors, and this is where we start breaking things down into a bunch of layers again. I've made no secret of this before. I love working in a lot of layers, and even though I may condense them later, the coloring of these layers is going to make things a lot easier to kind of work through, little references to get subtleties of shadow a little bit later on. So let me dive into a little bit of detail on that right now. In my mind's eye, we can take this picture and separate it into several layers. And we're going to kind of color code them to make it a little bit easier to refer to them later on. So in the foreground, we have a table with a teacup and Alice sitting in it, and we've colored that in that kind of orangish color. The color right now doesn't matter. We're just going to be using this as reference later for other layers that we'll kind of build on top of it. So again, the color is just meant to kind of separate it from other layers. So again, we have orange in the foreground. We have the figure right behind it in the green. Now, I was kind of tempted here when I was putting this together to make the head its own layer, just because that's how I developed the line drawing initially. The head was kind of sitting on top of the shoulders and sitting on its own layers, so I could resize it or adjust it as I wanted. But when I started doing the coloring on this, I decided to put the whole figure in green, because again, I'm going to use that as a reference to kind of pull layers out of it later. So what I will do is separate the skin more than just the head, and in doing that, I'll be able to accomplish some of the tricks of the shadow and the light that I want to, even though I didn't make the head its own separate layer. So again, just to review, we have orange in the front, we have the green kind of in the middle, and then right behind that, the purplish chair. And then behind all that, we'll have our background, which was a reference going back to the original music video that I based this off of. It's just a kind of checkerboard background that's really not going to get any real coloring to it. Although at the end, just as kind of a little bit of a touch-up, I'll throw a little bit of a shadow color in there, just to almost indicate that there might be a spotlight of sorts kind of shining down from above to inform our light source a little bit later on. So for right now, we're just going to leave that background as is, that checkerboard as is. We don't really need to kind of refer to it right now. We'll kind of use it as our touch-up piece a little bit later. So the focus, or at least the fun part for me, is to get into that figure. So that's kind of where I started a lot of the rendering here. Methods may vary on this. Some people like to work from background to foreground or vice versa. I'm really excited to kind of work on the figure, especially the face, so I kind of just dove right into it and started there. And since these are all separated onto different layers, I can kind of build on those as I see fit by focusing on one layer that just has nothing to do with the figure and then coming back to the other layers a little bit later on when I'm ready to. It's one of the beautiful things about digital medium. I don't have to worry about kind of painting over top of other stuff and hiding a piece of a background or a piece of an overpaint or something like that, which is what I love about this digital medium. So forgiving, so that you can do something like this and pull off these little tricks and kind of work in the order that you want to, so that way you can kind of take your time at developing it or make some different decisions down the line if you want to kind of postpone something. You notice some white getting laid in here as well. I think it might be important to kind of talk about this. Very rarely do you ever see me work in pure white. If I am ever using pure white, it's just maybe for like the highlight on the tip of a nose or potentially like a highlight on glasses or something like that. So in fact, the shirt that you're seeing here is not white. It's actually a slightly off-white, leaning more towards a light bluish gray. You'll see me do the same thing in the teeth as well. Typically we think of teeth as white, but they're often in shadow because they're behind the lips. So when I get to the point where I put in the teeth, you'll see me kind of doing something similar where I'm putting in something of a light bluish gray, and it makes it look a little bit more natural. If you ever put in a pure white on teeth, it's going to look almost fluorescent, and it doesn't really look very good when you try to put the rest of your shadows in around it and light source as well. The hair is going in next, and again, all I'm really kind of doing is building on top of the layer that I established before. So the green that I established for this figure is really a reference tool at this point. So if I take a layer and I color it in all green, then I can also mark it as a reference. And once I have it as a reference, every layer that I build on top of it will never go outside that pixel set that's been dedicated to that green color. And so what I'm going to be able to do here is lay in some of my colors really easy. These midtones go in super simple because all I'm doing is drawing the purple over top, but I don't have to worry about going out of the lines because it's all referring to that green layer that established my boundaries, if that kind of makes sense. As you build layers on top of things, the beauty of it is that each layer can be kind of something of a reference to the layer after it. So for instance, I'm laying in all my flat colors right now, my midtones, if that's an easier term to understand. But later, when I start working on the face, I have already colored in the face a specific flesh tone. And so I'll take that flesh tone layer, I'll put a layer over top of that and mark it as a clipping mask, referring to that skin tone layer. And that skin tone layer that becomes a reference, meaning that as far as a clipping mask is concerned, any painting that I do over that flesh tone will only be seen on that flesh tone, and if I overpaint into the jacket or in the hat, it's just hidden. You'll never see it. So this is how it allows me to keep my lines, my edges nice and crisp, and I can get like really, really big, bold strokes in there to get shadows in without having any worry of it overspraying or overgoing into an area that I don't want it to be in. I work in a lot of clipping masks in this mode, so it really kind of helps build up a lot of different layers, and it's just something you want to be aware of if layers are something that's something of an issue for you. I again work in a lot of layers, but I also periodically go in and kind of erase layers or condense layers. So for example, a lot of the rough sketches that I did that you saw in part 1, I've either condensed them into one layer or I've just deleted them all together because they weren't useful anymore, and that helps me get more layers a little bit later on when I get into the final stages of touch-up work and things like that. Now I am starting to kind of finish up these kind of midtones and flats, if you will, here. So let's kind of speak to the two blobs, so to speak, that you see on the checkerboard in the background on the right-hand side of the piece. This is something I do quite frequently. I use these blobs as something of a color palette that I can return to when it comes time to render shadow and light. So a little trick that I do when it comes to rendering shadow, and you can see me starting to do it right now. The shadows in this case are going to be the opposite of the light. So when I consider shadow and light, I always want to go with something that's a cool source of color and then a warm source of color. And those two opposites will inform, again, light and dark. So in this instance, what I think that I did was I went with warm shadow and cool light, if I'm not mistaken. So the blue color, the bluish gray that you kind of see in the upper portion of that checkboard pattern, that's going to be my light source. Now it's not going to appear just like that. I want to put it on a layer that'll be a blended mode. So I'll put it on a layer where I adjust it to an add blended mode, and that'll lighten up the color and give it a more luminescent quality. We'll see that going a little bit later. The opposite is going to happen for my shadows. So that kind of pinkish, well, warm color that's got a lot of gray into it, that second blob, if you will, is going to be my shadow color. And you saw me just kind of flash it right there, because the reason that it works the way that it's working is because I'm taking that warm color and then I'm putting it on a layer that's above all the other layers. I'm marking it, or excuse me, making it a blend type mode, a blend mode of multiply. This is very, very common with shadows, to take just something and make it a multiply blend mode on the layer. Procreate does this, Photoshop does it, a bunch of these other kind of digital drawing programs offer this multiply mode. And essentially all it really means is that when you paint down a color in multiply mode, it will pull up colors underneath of it to kind of give you a mix or a blend of those tones. So what I'm doing here is I'm taking this warm little color blob here is really just a reddish orange color, kind of the opposite of the blue. And I've desaturated, I made it mostly gray, and brought it about halfway down in terms of darkness. And then I'll paint it on a multiply layer, and because I'm painting it on a multiply layer, it will pick up colors underneath of it and mix the two together. So that warm gray mixed with the color underneath of it creates its own shadow. And that shadow tone will change depending on what I'm painting it on. So I'm using that same warm grayish tone to paint over the jacket and get my shadows, but I'm also using that same exact color, that same exact layer, to paint in the shadows on the face. Now there's going to be some subtleties I'll have to add in a little bit later, especially when I want to try to kind of get some of the softer shadows around his cheeks and around his mouth and things like that. But the color is still staying the same. The only thing that I might do a little bit later is lower the opacity, or potentially bring in a little bit of an eraser airbrush to kind of soften it a little bit. And then sometimes, depending on how soft I want the shadow, I might use the smudge tool to smudge it. And if I smudge, that usually lightens it up a little bit as well. So anytime I feel like my shadows are getting a little bit dark, all I have to do is just bring in the soft eraser airbrush or the smudge tool, and I can kind of make it a little bit more subtle and blend it in quite a bit more, so I can get kind of nuance, if you will. Some shadows I want to be kind of big, bold, hard lines, like around the jacket and stuff like that. And even that I'll even soften up a little bit later when I get in the light source. But around the vest, I really like the kind of bold shadows that I put in there. In the face, though, not so much. You do have something of kind of a hard line where the shadow comes in underneath the sunglasses, but when we get to kind of putting in the cheek shadow, and tone a little bit later on, that's where we really want the softness, because the cheeks, even on Tom Petty, curve. They don't kind of come to sharp points or anything like that. It's a little bit subtle what I've done here, but this is something I do in every single time I draw a human being, and that's make sure that I add red to their skin tone. It's the thing that I think really kind of breathes life into the figure, and until then, the peach color or whatever skin tone you use as your midtone for your figure can often look a little dead or lifeless, or even maybe even cartoonish might be the word I'm looking for. So it's a really, really good tip to kind of do this, is just take like a nice bold red and just paint it in the places where that blood really kind of comes close to the surface of the skin. Now, this is really important on the face, and you have a couple different areas where this happens with just about everyone, specifically the tip of the nose, the cheeks, maybe even a little bit of the chin and the forehead, depending on your individual's specific skin tones. But with Tom Petty, I kind of put it in on the nose, the chin, and in the cheeks, and then lower the opacity and use the smudge tool to kind of blend it in a little bit. You maybe, if you're looking really hard, can actually see some of that red still in there that hasn't quite blended out between the cheeks and in the chin, and again, a little bit in the forehead between the sunglasses as well. I want some of that red to kind of show through a little bit, but as the shadows and the light go in, the parts that are still a little bit bold and maybe even a little bit overpowering will kind of disappear and kind of blend on their own once the shadows and the light just have an opportunity to kind of balance all that out. And that's something to kind of consider as well. Some of these subtle shadows are starting to go in, the light source is going to start going in soon, and that's what I'm kind of doing, is moving back and forth between the two to achieve some sort of sense of balance. I often start a lot of pieces by working on the shadow first, and it can be really tempting to just do all the shadow and then come in later and do the light. But I found that when I was doing work like that in the past, my end result would end up being very, very dark, because I just put so much shadow in, thinking that the light would balance it out later, and it just never really did. So kind of doing a little bit of shadow, then coming back and doing some light, then doing a little bit of shadow and coming back and doing some light is a really good way to kind of make sure that everything kind of stays balanced as you go through the whole piece. And kind of work towards your final product. Now, I'm putting a filter on here, and it's a filter that I want to apply to only a specific area of the piece. So the way that a lot of different ways to do this, but the way that I kind of do it, because I think it's just easiest for me, is just to take my color and just make its own layer. So I put a layer over top every other layer that's on the piece, kind of all the way to the top of the stack. I colored it blue, just picked the shade of blue that I wanted. And the reason I went for blue on this is because I am going to be looking for a shadow effect. Now, even though my shadows are warm, we've already established that, I'm putting in a cool shadow on this because I'm trying to throw something more into the background and bring something into the foreground. So let me kind of break this down a little bit. Notice the areas that I'm kind of cutting out here. So again, what I started with is a layer that sits on top of everything else, colored it blue. I lowered the opacity so I could see what was behind it, and then started cutting out the elements that I didn't want in shadow. And if you notice, it's going to be the background and then the face. The brim of the hat, most of the torso are staying in shadow. The foreground of the teacup has also been cut out of the shadow as well. Now, why am I doing this? Well, again, this is a little bit bold right now. I'm going to lower the opacity in a little bit, but once I do, it's going to take everything that's the torso and the brim of the hat and kind of shove it into the background a little bit more. And this should hopefully create this illusion that the head is actually coming a little bit more forward and hopefully give it a little bit more depth. It's a subtle thing. I've already lowered the opacity, but that blue is still there. And if you notice, what's ended up happening here is the shadows in the vest and in the lower portions of the coat, and even over the hands, are a little bit more well, shadowy, maybe is the word I'm looking for, a little bit darker, a little bit more recessed might be the best way to put it. And again, it's just meant there to kind of pull off a trick, and that trick being that I want that head to come forward just a little bit more and sit in the foreground. Now, the other reason I chose blue for this is because the face itself is a mix of warm colors, of reds and oranges and things like that. So going opposite of it with that blue filter on the torso really helps create some contrast to give that depth that I'm going for also. Now, we're going to move along here a little bit, and as we kind of get into the next phase here, I just want to kind of point out that I put in a little bit of subtle shadow that I didn't point out a little bit earlier. So take a look at the area underneath the nose and above the upper lip there. You can see there's just a subtle bit of shadow there, and that shadow on either side of that kind of dip that goes in the middle portion of the upper lip there helps give this idea that the mouth is coming forward a little bit. I talked just for a couple minutes about this in part 1 video where we spoke to the caricature of Tom Petty. This idea that his mouth is a little bit large, he has something of an overbite, and his mouth kind of protrudes a little bit from the rest of the frame of his face. So in order to be able to try to pull that off, that effect in color, we have to render our shadows and our lights in a very specific way. In this case, the shadow is falling to either side of the lip, and it's mostly because the light source is coming above him and being partially obscured by the brim of the hat. A little bit of that light is going to see the protrusion, and that protrusion is where the kind of middle of the upper lip sits. I didn't really put much of a light source on it, but it was kind of implied that it's there just because of the shadows on either side of it. A similar effect was used in the underneath of the chin, underneath the lower lip, so that way it looked like there was kind of almost a divot, if you will, underneath the lower lip and the chin. Light source is now starting to go in. You can see where this sense of balance is going to start getting achieved. If our light source is coming from above, it becomes pretty obvious that there's going to be some distinct brightness coming under the bridge of his nose. But notice it doesn't extend all the way down into that kind of like the bulbous end, because that red is there, and I want to make sure that red kind of stays and doesn't get hidden by the lighter color that's going on top of it. Now, just a reminder, this lighter color is coming from that blue blob that you see over the right-hand side of the screen. It doesn't look distinctly blue, and that's because a couple things have been done to it. So number one, it's a desaturated blue. It's more gray than anything else, but there is something of a blue that kind of sits in there. And in addition, it's set on a blend mode. So this is the light source. It's put on its own layer, and it's kind of sitting by itself, and it's in a blend mode, I believe I set to add. And in add mode, it doesn't so much strip the blue out of it, but it does something similar to the multiply mode in that it creates a luminosity and helps kind of mix with some of the colors that already exist underneath of it. This effect was kind of used, I think, particularly effectively in the face. But again, notice it doesn't matter what color I'm using it with. It'll create something of a blend of the colors underneath of it, so that way I can use that color across the entire piece. So that blue was used as the light source for the face, but also for the jacket and for everything else that's in this piece, like the shine on the chair and the light source that'll come down the middle of the hat in a little bit. Now, I did take this light source and kind of fade out the edges of it a little bit, especially around the jacket. Different textures are going to create different types of shine and luminosity, and if I wanted to portray this concept that this jacket was made out of some sort of a fabric, having hard edges to the light source would almost make it look like it was made of plastic or rubber or something that gave off a lot of shine. Since that wasn't the effect that I was going for, and I wanted to preserve a lot of shadow here, because remember, it's meant to be sitting back a little bit and letting the face come forward. So subtlety was really kind of the method I went through on this one. And what I did was laid in the light source and then used the blend tool to kind of shove it or move it around until it blended into the chest portion of the jacket and around the arms as well. Now, between that blend, or that kind of mushing around and moving around of the colors around the arm sleeves, the kind of accidental effect here is that all this smudging between shadow and light helped make it so that the arms looked a little bit more round, and so it was a really kind of interesting effect to pull off. The similar thing was also done with the hat. You can see the light source of the hat's been put in, and all I'll do is just paint in one bold stripe at a time, then blend it out. If I don't feel like it's bright enough or it's rich enough, then I'll put in another bold stripe and then blend that out just to make sure I don't overdo it. I can always add on, but taking away gets a little bit challenging. Even though there is an eraser, usually it can create kind of some lines that I don't want necessarily to have in there. So I try to avoid erasing as much as I can unless I have a distinct purpose for it. Now, there's not really a whole lot else to do here. Everything's kind of starting to form. I'm taking a look at the face and matching it back up against the reference photo to make sure that I'm not missing something. And there are some subtleties left to do here. For instance, there's going to be some shadow on the teeth that I need to put in. I've started putting in some of the shadow on the lips, but I'll need to work on that a little bit more and add some highlights as well. And these things typically tend to look a little bit maybe almost invisible to the to the camera when you're kind of watching this in a high-speed playback. But one of the other things you should be seeing sometime soon is me starting to work on the figure of Alice in the teacup. Now, Alice in the teacup here was a little bit interesting because I started with a rough sketch that really just didn't look anything like a figure. And so I knew that this was one of those situations where I kind of betray my method and say, okay, I'm going to worry about making her look more real when I get into the coloring phase rather than trying to deal with it in the initial line drawing. So even though I'm pretty adamant about that line drawing, I wanted it to be solid. In this particular case, I kind of cheated a little bit. And it was mostly because I knew that Alice was so small, there wasn't going to be a whole lot of detail to get in there. So the line drawing was going to be actually mostly disappearing if I was painting this in a way that I thought that I was going to end up painting it. Mostly this had to do with getting her hair right. So I spent a lot of time just getting in the colors of her hair, but that also meant putting in the mid-tone of the yellowish, and then getting some kind of browns and some warm colors in there to kind of create some stripes, and some sort of maybe hopeful indication, some hint that her hair is wet from having been soaked in that teacup that she's sitting in. We'll talk about the line work and the coloring of the line work a little bit later on, but I'll just kind of skip ahead here just briefly to mention that the circles that kind of create the disturbance of the liquid that Alice is sitting in, the idea is to get this to look like tea. And so you can see that I'm kind of changing some of the coloring on a little bit. I'm trying to get the line work to kind of disappear by recoloring it a little bit. And I'm going to do this over the whole piece eventually, but it all starts with trying to get that tea rendered. And, in the initial picture that I use as a reference, I took a look at that for some subtleties as to what tea looks like and how to color it. And I also tend to drink a lot of tea myself, so I had a cup of tea sitting in front of me for reference as well. And the thing about tea is that it's relatively translucent. It is somewhat see-through, so you'll see some of the light bouncing off the bottom of the teacup in the actual liquid itself. But there's also some shadow that needs to be rendered for some of the darker areas. So I kind of went back to the method where you kind of take a color that you're already dealing with and then just go a little bit darker and use that to kind of create the subtleties and tone of the tea. I wasn't really going for shadow and light so much, so I didn't use the method that I spoke to before. It was really just more a matter of picking some colors and trying to match them up as best I could to what I thought tea naturally looked like. And of course, trying to blend it because some of those colors were different. Now, one of the things I did notice from looking at my own teacup is that tea seems to have a reddish brown tone to it. So even though I started with some sort of a base color, I eventually kind of used a airbrush tool to airbrush in a little bit of red and then smudged it around a little bit to get that effect of that translucency that we're starting to see kind of get pulled off right now. Again, some darker colors need to go in also to help sell this idea, but really what I think really kind of helps here is the little circular lines surrounding Alice, those things that say that she's disturbing the liquid she's sitting in. Once they get colored that kind of lighter color, and get away from the black that they originally started out as, I think it really kind of works sitting in that tea the way that it does, that we have those kind of colored lines there. I kind of like the effect. And it's another one of those ones where I wasn't sure how I was going to pull it off. I just wanted to kind of fool around with some color and see how it looked and maybe, do some tweaks later. And, as Bob Ross coined the term, and I'll steal it, it was a nice little happy accident that it worked out the way that it did. Now, me working in the foreground here is an indication that I want to start moving towards the end game of the rendering here. So I put in some nice subtle shadows and some highlights over the teacup. You can see the shadow that I put in the table in the foreground. All these were, kind of rendered using the same method that I spoke to before, using the warm color that I established in my palette over to the right-hand side of the piece. It's a really kind of handy method, and then the reason why I use that little palette method is because when you're working in blend modes, like multiply or add or something like that, the color that you're painting on is no longer that color. So if you go to try to color pick it later and then use that to paint in more shadow, it will not match. So the only way to get back to that initial desaturated, cooler, warm tone that you used is to turn off the blend mode, put it back into a normal mode, and then kind of pick the color from there, and then turn it back into the blend mode you started with and go back to painting again. This just kind of slows me down, and every time I do it, I kind of kick myself for not planning ahead. So the palette method that I'm using here really kind of helps out and just really kind of saving me some time and making sure that I'm keeping that consistent color over and over and over again. Now, that may not be so important to keep a consistent shadow color if I'm moving, say, from a flesh tone to the color of the jacket or something like that. But if I want to work on a piece of the jacket and then come back to another part of the jacket later, then I'm probably going to want some sort of a consistent color for the shadowing, and if I don't, well, some mistakes are going to be made and the colors won't be consistent. Some things just won't match up. Now, that's not to say that every shadow is the same color, and it should always be. So, I will say that I didn't do a lot of it in this piece, but in some other pieces that I've published in the past, I often do a second layer of shadow and a second layer of light. So that way I can get some darker tones where I want them, or some lighter highlights, even closer to white, where it might be appropriate. Again, I didn't do a lot of that in this one. There is going to be some of it you'll see a little bit later on, especially in the jacket sleeves and also in the waistline down by the torso. Mostly because, again, it's that attempt to take these areas that are really, really kind of receded in the background and give them darker tones. So that way we get even more depth out of it. But one of the things that I always worry about is going too dark. I work on a pretty bright screen when I work here because I'm using an iPad, and that bright screen allows me to really kind of pick and choose my colors wisely, so to speak. But I found that, if I'm working in a digital medium, that's not really much of a problem. For the most part, when I publish something, it looks kind of similar on the computer screen as it did on the iPad that I started it in. But if I have any intention of printing, this is a whole other story. Printing color is a tough thing when you're working in a digital media, because printing colors, the idea here is, as I understand it, is that printers can't handle as many colors as just a digital monitor can. So when you're printing, the printer is forced to make some sacrifices when it's trying to print some of the colors if it doesn't have those at its disposal, or doesn't have the ability to create them. And what ends up happening is dark, muddy tones as a result. As a matter of fact, I can use this particular piece as an example. I won't lie to you. I was pretty happy about this one. I was really proud of what I was able to do with it, and I pulled off some tricks that I never really kind of pulled off before. So once I got this thing all finished and done, I sent a copy of it over to my printer and printed it out, and it didn't turn out well at all. The drawing was great. The face looked okay, but a lot of the shadow was really muddy, and it just didn't look effective. As a matter of fact, the whole thing just looked dark. And, if I was to blow that up poster size, the line work would look great, but the coloring just wouldn't work. Now, there are ways around this. There are things you can do when you're choosing your color palettes to make sure this doesn't happen. But because I knew this wasn't something I was necessarily going to be printing out, or even selling for that matter, as something to print out, I wasn't really all that concerned with it. This was more of an experimentation with perspective and trying to render some human flesh tones and in a digital medium. So I embraced the digital medium, and I embraced the color palette at my disposal in doing so. Hopefully you don't mind, and again, the intent here wasn't to print it, so hopefully nobody's trying to get copies of this to print or anything like that. Now, one last thing here before we kind of wrap up everything. I just want to take a moment to talk just briefly about Tom Petty. He obviously is no longer with us, and this piece was largely inspired by his music. I spent an enormous amount of time listening to his music while I was working on the initial drawings, while I was doing the color painting of this, and even this morning while I was getting ready to record the audio for this, I was listening to one of his albums, just as something of an inspiration before getting ready to talk about this. I play some guitar myself. I think I may have mentioned that in a previous video, and Tom Petty wrote songs that are really approachable for anybody that's just like kind of learning to play guitar, as something of a big beginner or an intermediate player. And I think that really kind of speaks to his success, is the idea that, he didn't compose the most complex music in the entire world, but he did compose music that people enjoyed, that people could play. And that means, for the most part, that even though he's not around anymore, his legacy will live on, not just in his recordings, but more than likely at every open mic night across the country and hopefully across the world. He was a huge talent. And from what I was made to understand, just from watching some interviews with him and things like that, he was a really chill, laid-back kind of dude. And I can tell you, I absolutely appreciate that about somebody. Now, we're going to move into the final phase of this here, where I'm going to start doing some touch-up work. And the touch-up work really just kind of amounts to taking some areas where I kind of made some mistakes and going back and correcting them so that way they don't kind of bother me as I go back to look at it later. These final stages are important because what I end up doing here sometimes is get so excited about the end product that I end up, kind of publishing it or putting it out in the world with those mistakes still intact because I got so excited I forgot to address them. So one of the things I have to start forcing myself to do is to literally just stop and walk away when I think I'm done, and then come back to it an hour or two later and take a look at it and say, am I really done, or was there something that I missed? And some examples of some of that touch-up work come in a couple different areas, starting with the chair. Now, it's already in there, so you'll have to kind of like look for it, but there's a texture that's been applied to the chair over top of the yellow areas to give it something of a look of almost like a tarnished gold or something like that. There was also some work I did on the highlight of the piece of hair that falls in front of his sunglasses. And there was also another piece of hair that I'm going to add in a little bit later as a piece of touch-up. I wanted just one strand of hair to come forward and lay over top of the blue bow tie on the left-hand side of his face. What I'm going to do is just kind of paint it in a little bit later, so it's just a matter of taking a layer, sitting on top of everything else, including the line work, and then just color picking from the yellow that already exists in his hair, and using it to just paint over and add one single little strand. It's a subtle little thing, but for some reason it was important to me, and I really feel like it made the piece look a little bit more three-dimensional. I love to kind of overlap things wherever I can to kind of sell that three-dimensional look. And I know I use the word sell a lot when I'm kind of doing these videos, but that's what I kind of feel like I'm doing. I'm trying to sell you on the idea that this is Tom Petty, and if I'm not a successful salesperson in the way that I use the technique or rendering, well then, you're going to come away feeling like you didn't get the product that you bought, if that makes sense. Some flashing there happened on the screen, and I think it's starting to go in now. Yeah, I'm using some blend modes with a layer to put in some shine on his sunglasses. I didn't want to just do the typical white highlight. I wanted to get some color in there, and I also was looking for some texture. But more importantly, I'm experimenting with the blend mode. I'm not sure which version of luminosity that I want to use, add or linear light or screen. So what I did was paint it in the color and then went through the various blend modes to see which one kind of looked best, in my opinion. And then once I was kind of satisfied with it, I went in and painted in the lens on the right hand side to match it. I love this effect because if you notice, what I've done here is once I got it in, I also lowered the opacity so it gives it a translucent effect, almost see-through. And I think more than anything else, it gives the sunglasses something of a photorealistic look, especially when you consider I did not take that highlight all the way to the edge of the glasses. So I left it an edge exposed, almost as if it's the rim of the sunglasses. Touch-up work also includes trying to pull that face out a little bit more, so I add a little bit more of my lighter, kind of warm tone in there. And I added some around the lips as well. So I told you I was going to have to come back and revisit the teeth and the lips. I've got the shadow in on the teeth, and then a little bit of a highlight around the upper edge of the lip. Remember, this in Tom Petty specifically, his mouth is more pronounced, so that little white line up on the upper edge of the upper lip there is really going to help give you this idea that it's sitting out a little bit. You can see that I've also at this time painted in that extra strand of hair across the top of the bow tie, as I mentioned before. And it's just these little subtle points like this that I'm just going to kind of touch up as we go along, which means that we're basically coming to the end here. So since we are coming to the end, let me just take a moment here to get the shameless plug that I do on every single one of these videos. And I hope you don't mind, but I'm going to beg and I'm going to ask, make sure that if you haven't done so already, you take a moment and subscribe. The reason I do these videos is something of a passion project, and Tom Petty is a great example of that. I'm passionate about his music, and I love him for the music that he created. But the reality here is that I just want to know that I have an audience out there that I'm pleasing. And that means that you're subscribing, that you're coming back and doing more views, and hopefully even leaving some comments as to what you'd like to see in the future. In addition, I'm trying to grow that audience, so please share with friends and share with anybody that might appreciate what we're doing here. And I'll take one little kind of final word here to mention the background. Now, as far as the background is concerned, I made some mention of it here. I wanted it to look like the light source was coming from above, so I've already kind of treated it, and it was a really simple thing. Layer on top of the background line work, a little bit of a warm shadow on either side, and then just a bright light source coming from above using an airbrush to kind of make those shadows on either side of the figure just a little bit deeper. The comparison, the contrast of the two, I think brings the figure forward. And to a certain degree here, I really feel like you get this idea that he is sitting forward in the chair. Hopefully, again, that illusion is being sold to you a little bit, and it comes off the way that I want it to. I mentioned this before, I'll say it again. This is a fun project. I'm a fan, and this was definitely a piece of fan work that was something of a passion project. I hope you enjoyed it as much as I do. I got a lot of plans for some more pieces like this coming up in the near future, but if you have any ideas of something you'd like to see, again, feel free to leave it in the comments. I'm happy to take some feedback, I'm happy to take some ideas, and I'd love to hear your thoughts on this. In the meantime, don't forget to stop back soon, and thanks again for tuning in. Take care. I'll have more content in the near future.